So welcome everyone to the latest episode of the Business Maverick Show, where we're going to talk about the automotive industry. And I'd like to introduce today Ravi Sibal. And Ravi, do you want to give us a quick resume of what you've been doing in the automotive industry over the last couple of decades?
Absolutely. So started my career at Bentley Motors in 2000 when I was a bit less grey. I was on the GT program. Actually, before that, I was responsible for some of the last Rolls Royces to come out of crew. So the last of line Seraph, the last of line Corniche, phenomenal cars. Then did the Bentley Le Mans series, again, part of Bentley's triumphant return to Le Mans. And then went on to the GT. So I was responsible for the GT launch in the UK and globally. I then took a bit of a reflection. It was really my start into management consultancy. So I looked at the way that we develop new vehicles and took a period out, spoke to my boss and said, look, I think we do this the wrong way. I think there are things that we can improve. So I went away and redesigned the product emergence process, so the PEP process. I went to Lamborghini, Bugatti, Volkswagen Special Vehicles and Audi Quattro and understood what they did. And then rewrote the process for Bentley. I then decided there were other things I wanted to do, taking those same skills and thoughts into other industries. So I went to oil and gas via IBM. I went to PA Consulting and then became an independent consultant.
Fantastic. I'm really interested to hear about the company car scheme you may have had when you were at Bentley. That sounds brilliant. So the automotive industry feels like they've had decades and decades and decades of continual improvement, right? Bit better quality, better regulations drive efficiency, drive safety, all of those kind of things. And it feels like it's been a real traditional, incremental sort of evolution of things. There hasn't been any real massive pivots in that time. Maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like now we're at a disruption point for the automotive industry. And I'd like your views on, is that true? And is it just a disruption of the business model, or is it a full disruption of the industry itself?
I think it's very true. You just have to look at the traditional way the regulation was put together for the industry, and you would have the automakers very much part of that decision and driving the narrative with central government and international regulations being brought together by their own parties. What seems to have happened in more recent times is that the governments have started to say, no, we want to be in a driving position. That's obviously driven this push for battery electric vehicles. It's seen a change in the industry in terms of how those vehicles will be managed. You just need to look at the way that diesel regulation and diesel taxing happened in the UK. First of all, it was the right thing to do, then it was the wrong thing to do, and it drives a real change in the industry. So those things have definitely happened. The move now towards battery electric vehicles and some of the regulations that drives that are the fundamental shifts in the industry. They change fundamentally how vehicles are developed, delivered, relationships between OEMs, dealerships and the national sales organisations and eventually the customers in a very fundamental way.
And so obviously the obvious player there is Tesla. That's come in and created something new, right? They sort of call it a computer on wheels. That's their kind of attitude towards it. But their whole way of charging, selling, customer service is quite different, isn't it, to what the OEMs have been doing? It's how much of a disruption has that been, and how much do you see coming from other companies?
It's been huge. I mean, it's completely vertically integrated as a company. It's a very different proposition to a normal vehicle, and sometimes a consumer won't see that. But if you imagine Tesla owns its own dealer relationships, in-country sales, it owns the end-to-end relationship with the customer. That's a fundamental shift from the way that it used to be. So I can give you examples from my Bentley days where Bentley would launch a vehicle, they would go to their dealers, they would try and get retail sales. Those retail sales would be driven by the national sales organisations or the dealers, and those dealers would effectively give a ratio of around 40 to 60% of retail sales, and the rest would be wholesale. So that means that only 40 to 60% of the cars that are produced are specific for a customer. The rest of them are generic for a marketplace. That introduces risk for dealers, risk for the OEMs, and therefore there was a different relationship. What Tesla's done is fundamentally shift that. And what it's able to do is do that in a way where it's driving direct relationships with those customers. If you look at how those relationships change when those vehicles become secondhand, that's a really interesting dynamic in the marketplace, because it fundamentally shifts who will have that one-to-one relationship with the OEM. And if it's not the first owner, how do you manage that relationship? How do you manage feature availability? And a lot of things that we're seeing from Tesla are quite disruptive in that respect.
Yeah. So let's sort of kick off around battery electric vehicles, because it's interesting, isn't it? There's a lot of stuff going on in this space. A lot of, we've seen the regulations, certainly in the UK, of the 2030 date now being moved out. That's caused its own disruption by putting a stake in the ground and then moving it. We've got a charging infrastructure that everyone says is 5 or 10 years behind where it needs to be. We've got a potential problem that the infrastructure needed to make electric vehicles, if we all switch to electric vehicles tomorrow, the tax take on fuel, which is something like 22 billion a year, something like that, I can't remember the exact numbers, disappears. So how we can get that tax back? Well, we could do pay per mile. Well, great. We've now got to put a couple of £1 billion worth of cameras above, and put a whole payment system and everything else in. So it feels like it's half-baked, I'm going to be honest, and that's my opinion. I know lots of people love them and things like that. It feels a little bit half-baked. But what are your views on where that's going? What's good about the EV market? Also, second-hand market, I've been seeing some stuff recently. The second-hand market for EVs is just crashing. I mean, Porsche Taycan you can get for 50 grand now, because a 2-year-old one, because there's no market for it. So what's great about the EV market, and what are the problems behind it?
I think the EV market is good in some ways, in that it's driving us all to think about that relationship with the customer. It's driving us all to look differently at what goes on and how vehicles are sold. And certainly from a customer perspective, they're much, OEMs are much more aware of that relationship. From a physical vehicle perspective, I absolutely agree with you. I think it is half-baked. I mean, if you look at the reasons why the resale values have gone down, a lot of that is to do with the ability to repair them, the ability to insure them, the ability to manage them once they're in a crash state, and also the battery capability. I mean, people are realizing that actually I need to have independence in my vehicle. And I was having a conversation on the train this morning with the person sat opposite me, and we were talking about that independence of any given supplier to manage your mobility. So if I have an electric car, I am wedded to 90% my home electricity provider for the majority of my charge. So what happens when there's a problem? What happens when I have a problem at home? Does that mean I'm stuck? So there are lots of factors to think about in terms of how that works. I think that that there is a broader mix that's needed. You just have to look at some of the things that are coming out in the marketplace around hydrogen. Hydrogen fuel cell has been around for a long time. Porsche just discussed a direct hydrogen ICE engine, which is interesting. Still a few years off, but it's an interesting development. Porsche's drive with the EU around e-fuels, and that as a potential solution. And I also think that petrol and diesel will be a part of the mix. There are certain applications where they need to be part of the mix, and I think that's a fundamental question. It's you can't use the same size screwdriver for every job you're trying to do. So it's what applications give us the best mix. That then has massive implications for infrastructure. So where do I need charging? Where do I need hydrogen? Where do I need oil and gas? Can they sit side by side? I mean, if you think about what we're talking about in shifting from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles over the next, let's say, 10, 12 years based on the regulation, that's a massive change. If you think about the amount of waste we're going to have, not just physical vehicles that need to go and be recycled, but also the infrastructure that we need to do. So, your traditional petrol station, what are you going to do with that? Your networks of suppliers, what are you going to do with them? All of this stuff that we're doing around the national infrastructure has to change. But that doesn't even come close to the impact you're going to have inside those auto organizations. Because what you're fundamentally talking about is a shift in the skills needed inside those organizations. When you go from, having a traditional ICE car that's an integrated body and chassis, an integrated, powertrain that can be that is traditionally built together as one unit, you're now talking about a skateboard and top hat arrangement where that skateboard is quite generic. So if you go back 100 or so years and you look at how cars were traditionally engineered, you had, coach builders who will build the top hat to your car and powertrain and chassis engineers that will providers that would provide the runnings. Now, if we're going back to that world, that requires a completely different skill set, and that skill set doesn't necessarily all sit inside a single OEM. If we look at some of the thinking around that, if I have modular batteries, if I have some of this stuff, how do I use that to best effect for an industry? If we talk about economies of scale, do I do what the likes of Rivian are doing, which they provide the skateboard, they want that to be modular, they want other people to take it. How do you use that, and how do other companies say, well, we're not going to provide that skateboard and the chassis setup, all we're going to do is provide the top hat? Great, fantastic. That then changes your USP. Everybody's spent the last 40, 50 years looking at the engines and the interiors and all this performance. If every car can do 0 to 100 in sub 3 seconds, where's your differentiation? So the level of transformation we're talking about is fundamental. Absolute shift in the way that the industry is set up and how it's going to be regulated going forward.
That's fascinating. I think, we've worked with some of the automotive industry, and it's interesting how much effort goes into, what is the differentiator? Is it the styling? Is it the interior? Is it the engine? Is it the amount of road noise you have inside? Is it, and it becomes all of those things in some ways. But what you're saying is some of those things are just going to disappear because they've just been democratized into, I buy a chassis with some wheels on, it's what I put on top of it, right? And so that's really interesting. Okay, so the EV markets, it's there, it's building, but it's also got there's some cracks in the wall by the sound of it. We hear the term connected car a lot. Around sort of third-party integrated services and all those over-the-air updates. I've got a car that does over-the-air updates now, whereas before it used to be only when you took it in for servicing would it get an update. They'd plug it into a machine and give you 3 new features and 2 new bugs at the same time. But where's connected cars going? What's the connected car that people could set a sort of North Star against? What does that really look like?
Well, I think it's Tesla is a great example again. You can't take away from what they do and how they do it. But my question is that what we want as consumers? So I was again having this debate. I had lots of conversations on the train this morning about what are you actually selling. So if I am an OEM and I can turn on and off features, what am I selling? Am I selling a car with heated seats or no heated seats? Because actually, ultimately, Tesla can turn them on and off if I don't want to pay for them as a service. That's a really different proposition to going out and buying a used car where all the features that you buy are the features that you buy. That's a really interesting thing. You also talk about the data coming out of those cars. Who owns that data? Who is going to manage that data? What does that do in terms of additional services and features that we can sell to those consumers? It's a great opportunity for the OEM. Not sure what it does for the customer. You just have to look at one of the investments that I read about this morning, which is SoftBank putting 473 million euros into Cubic Telecom. Irish firm, really interesting setup. They're invested. They're working in the space of IoT and specifically vehicle IoT. So how do you get that data? What do you use that data for? Now, for that level of investment in that type of organization, it shows you that somebody's looking at it and going, right, I'm going to change the nature of that product. The same way we've seen smartphones come about that essentially have you as the data that you provide as the product. Are we going to see the same thing in the auto industry with connected car? That's entirely possible. The upside is that it allows us to hyper customize the features that for an individual. So do we want to see a hyper personalized experience from those OEMs and from the dealers if that's the way it's going to be structured? And I would say that's an upside. That's a massive upside.
And that hyper customization, I guess, if I get it right from what you said, you could just churn out cars, and I think they're doing this a little bit actually already, which is it's got all the features on. You just choose which ones you get turned on. And I suppose if I'm a second market car person, I buy the car off you. It might be at that point, the OEM clears all the features, and I can choose which ones I have turned back on again. I know certainly one of the cars I've got, there are people who are providing slightly illegal laptop services where they'll plug in a laptop and turn other features on that you didn't even know you had access to. For £150, you can get this feature added that I didn't buy it with. So yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? That kind of, we quite often buy a second-hand car. Oh, it's got to have the heated seats. Oh, it's got to have the the head-up display. And now you're saying, well, actually, you just buy a generic thing with all the featers on. You decide which ones are important to you. You can turn them back on.
I mean, if you look at some of the traditional models, a lot of the Japanese companies used to have highly customizable vehicles where they would allow features to be fitted at the dealership, whereas what you used to have with the German manufacturer was factory fitted, and there was a big differentiation. Not to say that they didn't get customized at the dealership, but it was a very different setup in terms of the industry dynamic. I think that's where we're heading, and I think it's an interesting set of outcomes and an interesting set of challenges. And if I'm honest, I don't think anyone's quite cracked it, and that's what makes this area so exciting. So one of my great passions is getting in and starting to work with customers about how do you solve these problems. It's only by getting 10 people in the room that have a perspective that you're going to get change. And I firmly believe that you need a combination of people who've been in the industry and people who haven't, people who look at it from a very different perspective. And I think that's a really powerful combination. You've got to bring in some challenge to the route, because if you don't, you're just going to get the same monotonous outcomes.